Right. So is that sharing well? Okay. So a few days ago, on the 25th of January, it was the 263rd anniversary of the birth of Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet. And many Scots and Burns fans around the world would have celebrated with a Burns supper in his honour, with a traditional Scottish peasant dinner of haggis, neeps and tatties, and speeches, poetry and song washed down with copious amounts of whiskey. And so to help you understand why he is so celebrated, I'd like to talk a little bit about his life and legacy, illustrated with historic 3D images from my collection. Burns was born in 1759 in Alloway, near Ayr, on the west coast of Scotland, in a small cottage that his father, a tenant farmer, had built. This cottage is now part of the Burns Birthplace Museum, which is run by the National Trust of Scotland. And it's well worth a visit. But in the mid-19th century, when these photographs were taken, it was actually a tavern. These first two views of the cottage are from a wonderful late 1850s series entitled Views in the Land of Burns. Unfortunately, I've not yet been able to identify the photographer. This view in particular I find very special. It's got great 3D depth and it tells an intriguing story. Who are the men in the top hats, and who's the mysterious woman waiting in a carriage outside the tavern? I feel that Burns could have written a poem all about this one. In this later Keystone image, you can see an advertising board outside the tavern showing prints and photographs for sale. And stereo views were a huge component of the souvenir market for Burnsiana. The science behind 3D perception and imaging was first elucidated by Charles Wheatstone in the 1830s, actually prior to the invention of photography. And Dennis Pellerin will be telling us more about this brilliant polymath later. By the late 1850s, 3D stereoscopic images, or stereo views, were by far the best-selling format of photograph. One of the earliest and most famous and prolific of the Scottish stereophotographers was George Washington Wilson. He was based in Aberdeen, which is about as far away from Ayrshire in Scotland that you can get. And he didn't travel to Burns country until 1867, when he took this fine view of Burns Cottage. It's quite rare for Wilson to have someone in the foreground so close to the camera. And in this case, it may well be Wilson himself with his famous bonnet on his head, which he'd used as a primitive shutter to take some of the world's first instantaneous views in 1859. Burns Cottage only had two rooms, one for the family and the other for the farm animals. It must have smelt rich, but the animals helped heat the house in the harsh winters. The Scottish peasantry was comparatively well educated, and Burns had 3 years of primary schooling, but by the age of 9, he was working as a farm labourer on his father's farm. In 1781, Burns left his father's farm and moved a few miles up the coast to Irvine to become a flax dresser. They were actually growing flax on the farm, and so this was to get involved in the whole process of flax. So it meant preparing hemp fibers to be able to spin them into linen. Burns didn't enjoy his time in Irvine, preferring the outdoor life of a farmer. Oh, what's happened there? Rats. Sorry, I must have pressed the wrong thing. Oh, right. You still have the right one. Okay. Um, so Irvine had actually been the largest West Coast Scottish port in medieval times, but the sheltered harbour slowly silted up and the town's fortunes had declined. Burns was at a wild New Year's party at the flax shop when a fire broke out and it was burnt down. So Burns headed back to the farm. On his father's death in 1784, Burns rented the 118-acre Moss Giel farm with his brother Gilbert. And this is a very early image of Moss Giel by an unidentified photographer, and it's prior to an extension to the farmhouse in 1856. Remember that this period is now known as the Little Ice Age, and farming had become almost a marginal activity for a while. And Burns was really struggling to make a go of it. During this time, the potato was becoming an increasingly important crop in Scotland, and the Ayrshire coast, which is warmed by the Gulf Stream, became famous for its early potatoes, but that wasn't soon enough for Burns. So Burns was a hopeless romantic, and he first started writing poetry as a love-struck teenager. He'd at least 13 children with 5 different women, and he wrote love poems for Anne, Anna, Clarissa, Cloris, Delia, Eliza, Jean, Jessie, Leslie, Lindsay, Mary, Nancy, Peggy, Phyllis. The list goes on and on. But the love of his life was the long-suffering wife, Jean Armour, who bore him 9 children. He first got her pregnant in 1786 and attempted to marry her, but her father was so against her marrying this penniless ne'er-do-well that she was banished to live with relatives far away. Burns was distraught. His true love had disappeared without a trace, his farm was a failure, and he was penniless. He turned to a neighbour, Dr. Patrick Douglas of Garallan in Cumnock, and he accepted his offer of a job as a clerk on his sugar plantation in Jamaica. This stereo view is of Garallan House in 1859, and the old woman seated is Jean Douglas, the daughter of Patrick. The photo was probably taken on her 80th birthday, and she would have been 7 years old when her father offered Burns the job in Jamaica. So she certainly knew of and had probably met her neighbour, Robert Burns. I find it amazing that with a single photograph, we can leapfrog back through the centuries and reach out to almost touch Burns. And when you look at the stereo view through the stereoscope, the 3D experience is so immersive that you feel as if you enter into and can explore the photo with its antique scenery, its buildings, modes of transport, and fashion. It really is the closest thing to time travel. Around this time, Burns meets and falls in love with Highland Mary and asks her to come to Jamaica with him. In order to fund the cost of the journey, he decides to publish a small volume of poems known as the Kilmarnock edition. Meanwhile, tragically, Mary dies of typhus and is buried in Greenock. One of the greatest collectors of Burnsiana was Dr. Ross Roy, and his collection, bequeathed to the University of South Carolina, is the most significant Burns collection outside of Scotland. Dr. Roy commented that if every certified lock of Highland Mary's hair was genuine, then at her death, the poor girl must have been completely bald. Burns' book of poems is discovered by the literary set in Edinburgh and generates great critical acclaim. Dr. Blacklock, a renowned intellectual and poet, writes to him from Edinburgh to congratulate him and propose an enlarged second edition. So Burns never went to Jamaica and instead borrowed a pony and rode for 3 days over to Edinburgh, where he became a celebrity. Incidentally, this view of Edinburgh is by Archibald Burns, probably the best of the Edinburgh stereophotographers. He started exhibiting as an amateur in the late 1850s, and the Photographic News reported in 1859 that if we take these stereograms as a fair average specimen of his skill, he deserves to take as high a rank among photographers as his celebrated namesake among poets. One of these that met Robert Burns in Edinburgh was a 16-year-old Walter Scott, and Burns made a profound impression on him. Scott recorded that his eye alone, I think, indicated the poetical temperament. It was large and of a dark cast, and glowed, I say literally glowed, when he spoke with feeling or interest. I never saw such another eye in a human head, though I've seen the most distinguished men in my time. Although Scott's sentimental style has now gone rather out of fashion, in Victorian times, his fame eclipsed Burns, and a huge monument to him was built on Princes Street, the main Edinburgh shopping street facing the castle. The Burns Monument in Edinburgh is much more discreet and in a more pastoral location on the flank of Calton Hill. I imagine that Burns would have preferred that. It's almost impossible for us to imagine today how difficult it must have been to become famous 250 years ago. There was no radio or television or internet or Hello magazine, only face-to-face meetings and word of mouth. Imagine what a remarkable and charismatic person Burns must have been to overcome his status as a peasant and be welcomed into the homes of the rich and famous. After another few years of farming struggle, in 1789, Burns took up a job as a customs and excise officer in Dumfries and continued writing poems and collecting Scottish songs. When he died and was buried there in 1796, at the tender age of 37, thousands lined the streets. So why is Burns important? In the 18th century, Scotland had been governed from London since the 1707 Union of the Parliaments. Two unsuccessful Jacobite rebellions had started in Scotland, and although they were really more religious conflicts than Scotland versus England affairs, nonetheless, parts of Scotland paid dearly for their failure. The Highlands were suppressed, tartan was banned, English garrisons were stationed throughout Scotland. The result could very easily have been the complete Anglicisation of Scotland. But the popularity of Burns' poems in the Scottish dialect helped ensure that Scots words survived. The patriotism of poems like Scots Wha Hae, celebrating the exploits of Wallace and Bruce, sustained national pride. He travelled the country and collected and improved over 300 folk songs, preserving an oral tradition which could otherwise easily have been lost. So the rich cultural heritage of Scotland owes Burns an enormous debt. There are many stereo views linked to his poetry. For example, genre-style reenactments like this scene from A Cotter's Saturday Night, recreated by Michael Burr. This image gives us an idea about how large and lucrative the market was for stereo views and Burnsiana. Imagine the cost of building a studio set and dressing all the models just to make this image. The expected sales must have made it worthwhile. Some of Burns' songs are world famous. For example, Auld Lang Syne is played everywhere on New Year's Eve. I worked in Tokyo for a year and one evening played baseball with my Japanese colleagues. And at the end of the session, the lights were dimmed and Auld Lang Syne blasted out. I laughed and asked them why it was being played and was told very seriously that it was an ancient Japanese song traditionally played at the end of things. Its name was Hotaru no Hikari, which means by the light of the fireflies. So it wasn't exactly a literal translation then. Many stereo views capture places in Ayrshire related to Burns' poems. This is the Tam O'Shanter Inn, called after the eponymous subject of Burns' most celebrated narrative poem. This view is by Stereo Travel, who in 1910 produced an exceptional box set of 100 views of Scotland. The photographer is Lynn Skeels, who I initially took to be female, and thought this might explain the empathy that the photographer had with the many street urchins that populate the stereo travel views. But I soon found out that Lynn was actually a guy. However, he does seem to have a great rapport with kids, or maybe simply rewarded them with sweets or a farthing to appear in his photos. I find it remarkable that in 1910, the vast majority of the children he photographs are barefoot. I really hadn't appreciated the level of poverty in Scotland so recently as that. Tam O'Shanter is a morality and temperance tale about how Tam goes drinking every market day in Ayr and ignores his wife's warnings of the danger of riding home drunk. One night when he's passing Alloway's old haunted kirk, he sees lights, hears music, and finds witches and warlocks in a dance with old Nick himself playing the bagpipes. Alloway Kirk is just next to Burns' birthplace cottage, and he was probably told ghost stories as a child to discourage him from playing in the ruins. If we zoom in on the gravestone in the foreground, we can see that this is actually the grave of Burns' father and mother, William Burns and Agnes Brown. Drunken Tam is aroused by the dancing of one young witch wearing only a short negligee, and he calls out, "Weel done, Cutty Sark." And in an instant, all was dark, and the chase was on. And Tam rides off with the witches in hot pursuit. They can't cross running water, and Tam just makes it over the Brigadoon, but one of the witches catches his horse by the tail, and the poor horse is left with only a stump. So Tam gets off quite lightly, really. The River Doon features in several Burns poems, like the banks and braes of Bonnie Doon, and so it's well represented in the stereo view. Burns' keen observation of the world around him have universal appeal. He used nature as a metaphor for the human condition. For example, on destroying a mouse's nest with his plough, he comments that the best laid plans of mice and men gang after glade. In the poem The Twa Brigs, the spirit of each bridge argue the value of tradition versus modernity, and the old bridge disparagingly claims, "I'll be a brig when you're a shapeless cairn." Burns must have been either clairvoyant or a sound judge of engineering, because in 1877, the new bridge was damaged in a flood and had to be rebuilt completely, while the old bridge was unscathed. There was another great literary figure living close to Burns in Ayrshire, James Boswell, who'd famously toured Scotland with Dr. Samuel Johnson and wrote his biography. Burns requested a meeting, but was snubbed. This was probably due to Burns' radical politics, while Boswell was a conservative landowner with a 16,000-acre estate in Auchinleck. And this is a wonderful stereo of the Auchinleck vine laden with grapes. On the other hand, Boswell's son, Sir Alexander Boswell, was a Burns fan, and he personally organized a public subscription to erect a Burns statue in Ayr, which was inaugurated in 1821. A year later, Sir Alexander had the dubious distinction of being the last man in Scotland to be killed in a formal duel. Perhaps the most important reason to remember Burns is the power of his politics. He supported the ideals of the French Revolution and had a strong belief in freedom and equality, the dignity and value of the common man. Lords are but the breath of kings, an honest man's the noblest work of God. Burns predicted, "For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man, the world o'er, shall brothers be for all that." It saddens me that over 200 years later, we seem no closer to Burns' dream. And with that sobering thought, I'd like to propose the traditional toast to Robert Burns, his immortal memory.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was fascinating as always.
Right.
Do you want to say a few words about this book?
Sure. Well, yes. Thank you, Dennis, and thanks everybody for your attention. If you are interested in finding out more about stereoscopy in Scotland, then please have a look at my website, www.scotland3d.com, which is just the word Scotland with a 3 inserted before the final letter. And also, please consider my rather special book, Scotland in 3D, a Victorian virtual reality tour, which is available at your favorite online bookstore or from me directly. And it's got over 200 3D views and takes you on a tour all over Scotland and a little bit about various Scottish photographers as well. And it comes with a fold-out viewer so that you can experience everything in glorious 3D. So that makes a lovely present for any fan of Scotland.